Just for fun, I'm going to draw it really old-fashioned with a butterfly valve. Air's going this way. I oftentimes have a little thing called a progression well in my carburetor, and I oftentimes have a little thing called a fuel screw. There's a little hole in the carburetor right here where there's a needle sticking through. That is if it is a fuel screw. And I'll show you both. I'll draw you both. So here's this little fuel screw in your carburetor, and you can tell it's a fuel screw if it's on the engine side of the carburetor. That's the engine side. I'm a doctor's kid, so I can have terrible handwriting. So on my progression circuit, somewhere down in here, I've got a jet feeding this well, and there's my fuel. And somewhere, I've got air coming up to an orifice in the bell mouth of the carburetor on the air filter side of the carburetor. In this situation, whether it's a butterfly or whether it's a slide, I'll show you both. This is a fuel screw because it's on the engine side, and because it, when it's closed, shuts off all fuel to the engine at idle, when the butterfly is where it is right now. But the thing that we're going to talk about now is that wrong color. The transition from idle, throttle off the grip, running 1200 RPM, sitting there going pop, pop, pop. I'm pulling fuel and air out of this distance between this needle and the hole for the needle. I seat the needle, I back it out 2 turns, 2.5, depending on what the manufacturer specs. Most engineers spec 2 or 2.5 for something that'll start and run and get you in the ballpark. So most carburetors, the rule of thumb is seat the screw and bring it out 2 to 2.5 turns. Okay, at idle, I'm pulling fuel out. The throttle's closed. There's high vacuum, low pressure over here. The fuel is getting a supply of air with it, so it's actually bubbles. It's beer foam. But as I open the throttle and I bring the throttle open, there's another set of holes draw this kind of thick walled so it makes a little more sense. Hey, that's good art. Okay, as I open the throttle, when it's closed, one last little comment. I've got air coming down this passageway meeting with the fuel, or perhaps on this vintage Mikuni, on this particular Mikuni, the air is actually mixing with the fuel in the little well where the jet is. But nonetheless, I've got air coming with the fuel up here to this progression well. I've got an idle mixture screw that, as I said, is for controlling fuel. As I open the throttle, these little holes transition. Right now, with the throttle closed, air is coming in these progression holes because it's very high vacuum, the throttle's closed, and it's mixing with the fuel to help atomize it better. And it gives it a better lift, if you will. As I open the throttle, now we're in color. Now we're real high tech. As I open the throttle, these guys stop pulling air into this progression well and they start bringing fuel out. Brand new markers. The reason that you need to understand this, or it would help for everybody that fools with carbs to know this, is that those are some of the tiniest holes that you've ever seen. The most unbelievable drill bits you've ever seen. And what that does is help you feed more fuel right there when you're accelerating the engine from idle. Car carburetors have had progression holes in their idle circuits forever. Chainsaw carburetors have them. Motorcycle carburetors have them. Even slide motorcycle carburetors have them. As the slide picks up, you go from fuel discharge in one position to fuel discharge in a couple of positions. And when the slide's all the way down or the butterfly's closed, same deal. All my fuel comes out where the screw is until I raise the throttle or open the butterfly. And now I've got to look and see when my carburetor's apart, are these holes open? So I spray some carb cleaner in here after I take the jets out and I clean the jets. And I want to know that if I spray carburetor cleaner or brake cleaner or water into this hole, I want to know that it's going to come out here. It's going to come out the progression holes, and it's going to come out here where the idle screw is, mixture screw. And I ought to know, the same thing ought to happen if I spray carb cleaner in here. The important thing to understand is there's these little tiny holes. If I didn't know what they were and I didn't know where they go and I didn't know what this does and I didn't know what this does, how do I know when I'm done and I have a carburetor body in my hand and it's shiny and it's pretty, but that doesn't mean I haven't unearthed the problem in here. Suppose this well is blocked up and now I don't get that progression anymore. I only got fuel at idle, and when I crack the throttle off idle, the thing stalls and quits. This particular little float assembly is from an early Honda. This is more like what you're used to seeing carburetors as well. A lot of times they're brass, they're soldered together. They're supposed to float. If they get full of gasoline or water, that's bad. When you're into the pilot circuit of a carburetor, which is what we're going to talk about today mostly, getting the pilot jet out on some Mikunis is a little tricky if you don't have the magic screwdriver. This is the magic screwdriver. It doesn't have any hips. You know, if it was to moon somebody and pull its pants down to moon somebody out the window of a moving car, which I've heard people do, not having any hips makes it a lot easier to get your pants off. This is what I mean when I say hips. These points on this screwdriver. So anyway, this screwdriver is the right width for a pilot jet all the way down the bore, because the pilot jet is the same width as the hole. And you want one that's been custom modified for such things. That little guy right there is where all the fuel for your motorcycle comes from, or goes through, so to speak, at idle. Here's one of his sisters. This is another pilot jet from Mikuni. A little longer, same kind of thing. Somewhere inside this jet is a very, very small hole. I'll show you how small here in just a minute. I'll show you some jet drills. It's unbelievable how tiny they are. Anyway, the carburetor on the motorcycle at low speed, all the fuel's flowing through this guy, and a lot of people in cleaning a carburetor, they don't understand what all's involved in this circuit, and so they can't test to see that the circuit is flowing properly because they don't know how it works. So here's what we're going to talk about today. There's two ways in general that people make carburetors for motorcycles in terms of idle circuits. There are idle circuits on motorcycles where there's an adjustment for the mixture that's out on the front of the carburetor, on the engine side of the carburetor, and that's typically called a fuel screw. When you turn that screw all the way in and the engine's at idle, you stop the fuel that's discharging for the engine and it should quit. Some motorcycle carburetors get their fuel-air ratio tuning from an adjustable air screw, and the pilot jet is fixed, and that it's sort of a teeter-totter, if you will. This regulates how much fuel ultimately I can get out of these holes, but I'm softening that delivery by putting air in this tube, which makes less pull, for lack of a better term, on the pilot jet. Now, the reason I drew this thing is because most folks, when they're into a carburetor and they're cleaning it, they have a tough time because there's all these holes and they don't understand what they do. And if you don't know what those holes do, it's pretty hard to figure out whether they're clear or not. But either way, there's a set of holes in a carburetor since the beginning of time called progression holes. And the reason they're important to understand is when you're at idle and the throttle's closed almost fully, the only fuel this engine's going to get, if it's a fuel screw engine, the only fuel it's going to get is out of this hole. And you adjust how much it is and you change the mixture at idle. But as soon as you crack the throttle, and you can do the same thing with a slide carburetor with progression holes, but whether it's a butterfly throttle or whether it's a slide throttle, as soon as you crack the throttle, it starts discharging fuel out of these guys. So it's getting additional fuel. And the maximum amount of fuel that it can pull at that point when the throttle's open slightly and it's feeding out all three holes is the size of the pilot jet. At idle with the throttle nearly fully closed, the maximum amount of idle mixture that it gets is controlled by this screw. So when I'm troubleshooting the carburetor, or when I've got it apart and I've got the jet out and I've got this screw out, I should be able to shoot carb cleaner in these holes and see it coming out, not just the main discharge for idle fuel, but I should see it coming out these progression holes. There's a little well in the carburetor where they machined all that stuff, and then they put a little plate on the back of that well to cover it up. And if that thing gets full of grunge, it is a tough time getting all of those little holes to start flowing again. The air screw carburetor is pretty much the same setup, except instead of tuning this discharge hole directly, you're tuning the air bleed. Same sort of situation though. It's got progression holes, and at curb idle, throttle all the way closed, it's filling the engine or fueling the engine just at this hole. As you roll the throttle open now, instead of air coming in these holes and mixing with that fuel that's going to the engine, as you crack the throttle open now, you start discharging fuel out all three holes. The jet itself has got a big entryway, or this is the entryway, this is the bottom of the jet, the fuel's going up, and it's got a relatively big discharge, but the actual thing that controls the fuel is a tiny little orifice in here that's very hard to see with the naked eye. You can look up at a light with a clean pilot jet and you can get a pretty good idea how big that hole is after you've compared several over the years. But you've got to know how to clean this pilot jet, and you've got to know how to clean the entryway to it and the exit. Also, some pilot jets have these little cross-drilled holes. That's combining the air bleed and the fuel into one little unit. Those little holes right there is where air comes in and mixes with the fuel that's coming up. So the pilot jet on some Makunis, when you see these little cross holes, that is determining how much air I've got with my fuel, and it has a big influence in how the fuel is pulled. This little device, by the way, is called an otoscope, and it works wonderfully, but its focal point is right out here on the tip. You put the jet right here on the tip of the otoscope, and if you're half blind like me, you get your magnifier light, and you look through your magnifier light at your magnifier on your otoscope, and you can look right down that hole and you can see how clean that hole is. And then you can flip the jet and look at the other side, so you'll be able to see the big hole on either side of the little hole, and you'll be able to see how clean the little hole is. So if you're in motorcycle carburetors pretty regularly, these otoscopes are fantastic help. All right, when we talk about cleaning pilot jets, I mean, I've got an ultrasonic cleaner. It's a great device, and I use it all the time. But when it comes to pilot jets, I still do this little ritual, because this hole is small, extraordinarily sensitive. If you put a drill bit in there to clean out this part of the hole and gouge, you can put a burr in here, that changes how it flows. The people that make these things oftentimes have a machine that checks the flow after they drill it, because when the drill's worn, it drills a slightly different size hole. It's a sensitive little beast. So the best way I know to clean a pilot jet is to thread a piece of copper wire through it, and actually hold the copper wire and spin the jet with your other finger. I suppose it would help if you're a good guitar player. Anyway, that's how I'm cleaning these walls right here where it's very small. And I'm doing it with copper wire because it's soft, very closely related to brass, which is what the jet's made out of, and I'm not harming the hole. Okay, and when I get done doing that and blow, hold this thing up and look in the light, I can see if it's clear, especially if it's a multi-carbureted motorcycle, and I can look at its brothers and sisters. But then the other thing is, what do I do about this part of the jet? And what you do is you take several strands of the wire and make a brush. See how many strands you can get twirled up and going inside that jet. Looks like I got a couple too many. Pull them back. And you custom size your brush to that inlet airway. Once again, thanks for watching us. Stay tuned for part 3.